Hey everyone, welcome to Travel Through Stories. My name is Sean, and today we're going to do a Q&A. We recently passed 1,000 subscribers somehow, and I asked here on YouTube and over on Instagram if you guys had any questions, and surprisingly, you guys had a bunch. So I'm going to go through them more or less randomly. There weren't many repeat questions, and there was a pretty good mix of personal questions, bookish questions, and then professional questions. So I'm not going to give it a structure. I'm just going to go through them kind of at random.
Hey, editor Sean here. This video ended up being way longer than I initially anticipated, so it's going to be broken up into two different videos. I'm not going to timestamp all of the questions, but I will put the names of the people whose questions I answer in the description box of each video. So if you want to search that way, you can. Sorry for rambling so much. Anyways, back to the video.
Before we begin though, I do want to just say thank you. When I started this channel, I really did not expect anyone to watch, let alone reach 1,000 subscribers. It's pretty humbling and honestly quite baffling that there are that many people who want to watch me talk about books. So thank you. But anyways, let's just jump into the questions. So the first one comes from YouTube. Yahaira Ferreira asks, what's your favorite way to find new books? Do you have a favorite bookstore, brick and mortar or online? And what do you read that leads you to such unique finds? So for the first question, what is your favorite way to find new books? My biggest advice is to follow people on social media who are more well-read than you. And that doesn't mean follow me, by the way. Go look on my Twitter, my Instagram, look who I follow, and then follow them, because they're much more well-read and much more intelligent than I am. But yeah, since starting this channel and since being on social media platforms, which I was never on social media platforms until then, I've just been encountering so many great works and so many intelligent people talking about great books and great authors. And so that's kind of my main way of finding new authors now. I also just look at I look at publishers that I like. If Archipelago is publishing an author, or Deep Vellum, or New Directions, usually they're pretty good authors. Usually I'll check them out. And I also just like to see what my favorite authors are talking about, what authors they talk about. So often I try to find authors by proxy of authors that I already like. But her second question was, do you have a favorite bookstore, brick and mortar or online? Right now, I don't really live too closely to any nice bookstores. And for the past decade or so, most of my book shopping has been online, unfortunately. I tried to use websites like Abe Books and order books through online used booksellers, but I'll often also order directly through the publisher. There are a few used bookstores that I've been to that are kind of near me, and when I go there, I absolutely adore it. But just for the longest time, I mean, the small town that I grew up in, the closest bookstore when I was growing up was a Borders, and it was a 45-minute drive away. So I've just been used to ordering books online, which is a bit of a shame. I will talk about a bookstore that I really like in just a little bit because another person has a question on it. So we'll come back to that. But then her final question was, what do you read that leads you to such unique finds? And I really don't know. I spoke about this a little bit. I have just a really eclectic reading taste, and I just move between books more or less at random. I try to find books that people aren't talking about. If I see like a new publication and I don't see people getting hyped about it or something like that, I usually am drawn to that book. I'm kind of a contrarian by nature in that way, in that I don't really get drawn to books that everyone is talking about, not usually at least. So usually if I find like a little known author or a little known book, that's what gets me really excited. So I suppose that leads to some eclectic finds. She also asked a couple other questions. One is, how's the dissertation going? It's going great. It's going great. Thank you. No, the dissertation's fine. If you ever worked on a project that has taken years, it feels like it's always just moving at snail's pace, and it feels like you're never getting anything done. But that's just the name of the game. It's going fine. Thanks for asking. And then she also asks, what's a book you love but you feel most people misunderstand or ignore? And I'll take this as two questions. For the first one, what's a book you feel most people misunderstand? Interestingly, when I first saw this question, my immediate thought was Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. And over the past weekend, yesterday, as of recording, Orpheus, Drake, made a video in defense of Blood Meridian that really spelled out a lot of my thoughts on how people misunderstand Blood Meridian, which is a great video. I'd really recommend you check that out. But I would say that's a book that I find a lot of people, especially online, especially on Reddit, places like that they just really, really misunderstand. I'm also going to say Beowulf for this one. A lot of people have read Beowulf. I'd say most people have read Beowulf, and they were probably forced to read it in high school. And that just leads to misunderstanding, because a lot of people have all these preconceptions about Beowulf art. They think it's like this heroic man fighting all these monsters. And I think that just ignores so much of the lament that is that poem. So much of the elegiac themes, the elegiac tone of that poem. And I think a lot of people need to reread Beowulf when they're a bit older, outside of high school, because I think it's really just a brilliant poem. And I think a lot of people just have a lot of preconceptions about it, because again, they were forced to read it in high school, and it was usually taught by teachers who had the best intentions, but probably didn't understand Beowulf too much. So Beowulf and Blood Meridian, I'd say. And then what's a book that I love that I feel most people ignore? I'm going to just say, in general, contemporary Icelandic literature. I think outside of Iceland, very few people talk about a lot of the authors that I love. People like Jón Kalman Stefánsson, people like Sjón, people like Oida Ava Ólafsdóttir, contemporary Icelandic literature. The Interpolations on YouTube asks, if you had to choose a single book that is most representative of your literary taste / what it is that draws you to the medium, what would you pick? Speaking of Jón Kalman Stefánsson, I'd probably pick Heaven and Hell by him, which I realize a lot of you probably haven't read, but it's what draws me to it, and why it's kind of representative of a lot of my literary tastes is it's about just these two young men in a fishing village in the West Fjords in Iceland as they just go about their daily lives. But Jón Kalman Stefánsson is able to take this seemingly meaningless, this tiny fishing village, and these tiny people in this village, and explore their relationships and their lives in such a way that make their lives cosmically important and make their relationship cosmically important. And I think that's really one thing that I love about literature, is how it makes the mundane, the ordinary, extraordinary, how it makes these small things that, a lot of people don't really even think have any meaning, honestly. And it makes them the only thing that matters in this world. A book like Jón Kalman Stefánsson's Heaven and Hell explores the grandest questions of the universe in a lot of ways on the smallest of settings. And that's something that I love, that I think literature specifically is uniquely able to do. The Interpolations also asks, what's your favorite collection of poetry? And I'm a medievalist till I die. The Exeter Book of Old English poetry. That anthology, for my money, is just one of the greatest collections of poetry ever. I love the poems in there. They're the ones that I revisit the most. I reread them all the time. Go read The Wanderer or The Seafarer or The Ruin in that collection. I think they're absolutely astonishing. Even if you get rid of the Old English language that I love, and just look at it in a modern translation, I think they hold up. I think they're amazing, moving poems. So I'm going to go with that. I might also throw in the Poetic Edda in Old Norse, which is the source for most of our understanding of Norse mythology. Those two collections, the Exeter Book and the Poetic Edda, they're honestly the collections of poetry that I revisit the most. You were probably asking about kind of contemporary or modern poetry, and I don't really read that much modern poetry, honestly. Olav H. Hauge in Norway is a poet that I really like, and I've been reading some of Tarjei Vesaas's poetry as well. I like really kind of simple poetry, so I'll throw them in there too, but I don't really read that much poetry. I want to read more, but I honestly I never get around to it for whatever reason. All right, Trey Smith on YouTube asks, wanted to ask about the aesthetics you enjoy from certain publishers and which ones you might enjoy more than others. So when it comes to publishers, I really like a lot of more kind of indie publishers, places like Archipelago, Deep Vellum, New Directions, NYRB, places like that, publishers that focus on translated literature, on reviving forgotten literature. I like publishers that do that. Any publisher that's taking risks and publishing completely no-name authors in translation, or no-name in the Anglophone world, of course, or reviving authors that no one has talked about or written like an academic article on in like 70 years. I think that is so bold. And so, yeah, I usually go to publishers like that. And then for like aesthetic purposes, I will say, just because he lists a few different examples of like Penguin, Modern Library, Edmonds Library, and stuff like that, I will say I like Oxford University Press their publications much more than Penguin publications. I find Penguin over footnotes things a bit too much, so I usually go, if there's a Penguin edition and an OUP edition, I usually go for the OUP. All right, Aboutchuckb on YouTube asks a question that I am wholly unqualified to answer, but I'll try to give you a brief answer. But they ask, my question to you is what medieval Spanish literature, if any, has influenced the Western canon? I've never heard a good explanation as to why it seems no one recognizes any works prior to Cervantes. So again, I have no qualifications to answer this question. I'm not that familiar with the history of Spanish literature. But I will say, I mean, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find that many people who talk about English literature before Shakespeare, right? There really isn't that much. A lot of people will reference Chaucer, and they might have read Beowulf at some point, but a lot of people go to Shakespeare for the kind of the beginnings of modern English literature. And I think that's probably the same in Spain. I will say that Spain probably has a much more varied linguistic background than English. Throughout the Middle Ages, for instance, I mean, Spain wasn't a thing, right? It was Al-Andalus that was kind of on the Iberian Peninsula, and there were all different kinds of kingdoms with all different kinds of languages, all producing their own literature in their own dialects of what will become, in some ways, Spanish. So perhaps that's one of the reasons, too, why there isn't like a perfect trajectory, as we like to think that there is in other languages like English and French. In the Iberian Peninsula in the Middle Ages, there was a lot of Islamic rule, for instance. So there was a lot of literature being written in Arabic and in Hebrew and in, again, all of these dialects of Spanish, Castilian, etc. So perhaps because you have all of that, it's harder to draw a single line through the Middle Ages, through Cervantes, up to contemporary Spanish literature. I will say there is one poem, which I have down there, but I'm not going to grab, that's really quite good in that I've read, that I'm familiar with, that's quite good in medieval Spanish, which is El Cid. It's pretty famous. Other than that, I'm not very familiar with this topic, so I apologize for giving a lackluster answer. All right, Matthew on YouTube asks, what do you hope to get out of making videos? What do you hope viewers get from them? These are pretty good questions. I would say for the first one, what do I hope to get out of making videos? I would say they've already really come true, my hopes, which is just having a voice, being able to talk about books, being able to have a voice in this conversation about literature. I would say that was kind of my goal when I started making videos, and I'm pretty content with where I am right now. I will say that another goal that I had when starting this channel was to get a few free books. I thought that if I made a channel and talked about books, then like maybe a publisher or two would send me some free books. And I've gotten a couple of free books, so I would say this channel has been a success so far. And what do I hope my viewers get out of my videos? I would say I hope that I give a, maybe not unique, but a different perspective than they might expect on all of these great books that I like to read and that I like to talk about. I think in some ways I'm a weird reader in that I'm a medievalist first, and then an appreciator of contemporary literature second. So perhaps I have like a unique perspective that people weren't necessarily expecting. So hopefully that comes across in some way. And I think also, I haven't really done this too much yet, but I do want to make more videos on medieval literature because I really do want to more explicitly, I think in the future, bridge this gap between medieval literature and contemporary literature. I think that gap is so vast in how we like to think about literature, and I want this channel to bridge that gap in some ways. I know I haven't done it too much yet because I haven't made too many videos on medieval literature, but I want to do that more in the future because I think that'd be an important project, and that's something that I think I'm uniquely qualified to be able to do. He also asks a few other quick questions that I'll try to go through as fast as I can. He asks, have you found yourself reading books differently since starting this channel? Yes, this is a weird one. A completely unintended consequence of starting this channel is that I used to go to booktube all the time for recommendations, and I still do a lot of the time, but I often find that if there's a channel that I really like and they've already talked about a book and they've already talked about it in what I perceive to be a very effective way, I'm kind of put off to reading that book because now whenever I read, I think about what kind of video I can make after I read that book. And if, Leaf by Leaf has already done a great video on a book, why would I read it and put out my own stuff? Like he's going to say much smarter, much more intelligent things in a much more coherent way. So and I realize that is a really bad way of thinking. That's an unintended consequence, I think. But yeah, I feel guilty if I read a book and don't make a video on it now. So that's kind of bizarre as well. He also asks, are there any books you absolutely love but would find difficult to make a video about? I find it, I don't know if I have a specific example of this, but I often find it difficult to make videos about either really big books or books that are very experimental. And I realize I've done that quite a few times, making videos on like Péter Nádas's parallel stories and stuff like that. But I do find it difficult to condense all of that into a 10 to 20 minute video. I would say, actually, now that I've thought about it, I think an example of this is The Eighth Life by Nina Hartz-Chevelli. It isn't experimental in many ways, but it's so grand that I finished it and then I went, how could I ever talk about that book for like 10 to 20 minutes? It would be impossible. The book's way too big. So yeah, I often find it difficult to make books about, make videos about very long books, even though I read a lot of those and I do try to make videos on them. He also asks, do you have any hobbies aside from reading and running? Grad school kind of beats hobbies out of you, at least in my experience. And now that I used to read for fun and now I read and make videos and now it kind of feels like work, yeah, not much. In the summer, I do a lot of hiking. I do a lot of outdoor stuff. But yeah, I mean, in grad school, at least in my experience, you don't really have time for hobbies. Matthew also asks, do you have any long-term reading goals? And then he gives like a couple of examples, like reading medieval lit, different languages or other. And I would say a long-term reading goal that I have is, it's always to read more and to read more widely. Every single year, that's what I tell myself. I need to read more and I need to read more widely. But in terms of specific long-term goals, I would love to be able to read more literature in the original language. Obviously, I do this all the time with medieval literature, whether it's Old English, Middle English, Old Norse, whatever. But I would really love to be able to read contemporary Norwegian literature in the original. And I'm working on that currently right now. And I'd love to be able to read more Icelandic literature, contemporary Icelandic literature in the original language. Those are my two probably specific long-term reading goals, is to be able to read more in the original language, specifically those two languages. And then the last question that he asks is, do you write fiction yourself or have any desire to? I used to write fiction a lot in my early 20s. I wrote a bunch of stories, and I was just really bad at it. So I told myself that I'm going to go to school, I'm going to read as much as I possibly can, and then perhaps revisit writing in the future. Something that I'm not a genius or a prodigious person who's able to, like Zadie Smith, write White Teeth when I'm 23 years old or however old she was. I need much more time than that. So I'd like to revisit writing in the future, but I want to get all my studies done. I want to feel like I'm well-read enough in order to approach it, because I'm not the kind of person that could do so otherwise. All right, Morbid Swither on YouTube asks, my question is, what did you do to find the success you have found? Literature is my life and I don't know how to incorporate it into my career. He acknowledges that this is a big question. This is a tough question. And it depends on what you mean by success, as I feel like I'm still looking for success. But if you mean in terms of this channel, I would say just put yourself out there. I was thinking about making videos on books for probably the past 4 years or so. And I just kept putting it off because I kept feeling like I wasn't well read enough. I haven't read enough. I don't know that much. And for about 4 years, I kept telling myself, like, you're not smart enough yet. You're not well read enough yet. Wait. And then I just randomly kind of made it on a whim. I just immediately wrote down a script, recorded it, and put the video out the next day. And I'm really glad that I took that chance, because I'm probably still not well read enough. There are people out there who are way more well read, way more coherent speakers, way smarter than me. But so in terms of this channel, if you're looking at this channel and thinking that this channel is successful in a way, my best advice is just put yourself out there. I don't think you have to really overthink it too much. I didn't do anything tricky. I didn't play the algorithm in any ways that I could control. I didn't I didn't put in all the effort to make cool thumbnails and stuff like that. I just started making videos, and some people have come and watched, and it's been incredible. So yeah, I mean, if you want to do something like this, I would say just start talking to other people who make content out there, see what they're doing, and then just start making videos. It took me like, I don't know, 3 months or so to get like 50 subscribers. So it takes a while, but if you just consistently make videos, I don't know. If what I have is success, then that's my only advice. But yeah, I mean, if you want more personal advice, just DM me on Twitter and let's chat. He also asks a bunch of questions about music, which I'll try to answer as quickly as possible. I don't listen to that much music, which I know is a weird thing to say, but he asked a few questions, and I think I have some answers. What's your favorite contemporary pop song? I'm not sure if it's contemporary, but I'd say my favorite pop song is Björk's Bachelorette. Love that song. He asks, favorite classical work? And I don't really listen to too much classical music. I listen to a lot more neoclassical, and specifically I listen to a lot of like Icelandic neoclassical music. So people like Jóhann Jóhannsson, Hildur Gutnadottir, Olafur Arnalds Vikingur, Olafsson. I listen to a lot of that kind of stuff when I'm reading. But yeah, I don't really listen to that much like proper classical music. Favorite jazz composition? I don't listen to enough jazz to have an opinion. Favorite arresting world music track? I'm not really sure what you mean, but because you're saying arresting world music track, I'll say Esjan by Bríet in Icelandic is quite a good song. Most emotional classic grunge? Nirvana, I guess, kind of the basic answer, but I don't listen to that much other grunge. Preferred drinking song? I don't really sing when I'm drinking, though my friends do constantly remind me that in college, when I was drinking, I would tend to recite Old English poetry, which is probably pretty damn annoying. But yeah, I don't really have a good answer for that one either. Sorry. Okay, and then Refat on YouTube asks a question about the Icelandic sagas that I'm going to try to answer in full. But if you're not that interested in Icelandic sagas, just skip ahead to this time because I'm going to try to give a pretty good answer on this one. But he asks, if any non-academic person wants to start reading Icelandic saga literature in translation, is there a particular order, i.e. Chronology, genre, etc., that they should follow to get the utmost understanding of the style, tradition, history, and legends? Yes, I think there's a pretty good way to move through these. And what I would say is to start with the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda. These are the two Eddas. The Poetic Edda is all of these poems that are much older. The manuscript dates to around the year 1270. All of these poems are, some of them go back to before the year 1000. They're quite old. But this is all the Norse mythology stuff. And then Snorri Sturluson's Prose Edda was written around the year 1220, I believe. And he also compiles all of this Norse mythology into a single volume. And both of these are quite short. I would say read those so you have a decent understanding of the mythology. If you don't want to deal with the original texts, the original text in translation, you could also do read a retelling of these stories. Neil Gaiman's Norse mythology is a pretty good way to get into this mythology. But you want to have a basic understanding of these stories because they're not that important in most sagas, but occasionally they will come up in a very referential and elusive manner. And so you want to kind of be aware of them. They're also fun. But I would say once you do that and read the Poetic Edda and the Prose Edda, I would then start reading the family sagas. When people talk about the sagas of the Icelanders, right, in this big box set, the sagas that they're really talking about are the Íslendingasagur, the sagas of the Icelanders, the family sagas. And these are, the sagas like Njal saga, Egil saga, Grettir saga, Eric the Red saga, Greenlander saga, stuff like that. And those are some of the earlier sagas. Most of the family sagas are written beginning around the year 1220 and going up until around the year 1400. And you can look up chronologies of these if you want. But the first sagas, things like Gisli saga, Egil saga, those are written between around 1220 and 1250. And then the later Icelandic sagas of the Icelanders, things like Grettir saga, are written around the year 1400. But the family sagas are just much more realist sagas that deal with things like family and feud and the law and all of this different stuff. And I think that is the best place to start, because I think those are the gems of Icelandic literature. You can read the legendary sagas, the Fornelder saga, and stuff like that. Most of those are much later. Most of the legendary sagas, right? When you think of Volsunga saga, Saga of the Volsungs, Hrolf saga Kraka, the saga of Hrolf Kraki. Most of these are 14th century or late 13th century. So in terms of chronology, if you want to go through them, I would say the best way to read them is also more or less chronologically, which is read some of the mythological stuff, then read the family sagas, or at least most of them, or not most of them, some of them, and then you can start dabbling into the more legendary sagas. Because I think you'll see a through line from that trajectory. You'll be able to see why these sagas moved in this way. But he also notes that he has read two shorter sagas, Eric Saga and the Saga of the Greenlanders, and he plans on starting Njal Saga. I would say that's fine. I would say that's a pretty good idea. People are always interested in the Vinland sagas, in Eric the Red Saga and Saga of the Greenlanders. And they're interesting, of course, because of the discovery of North America. But they're actually really bad sagas. Like at a craft level, they're not very good sagas. They're interesting for some of the things that they do, especially with the interactions between the Norsemen and the indigenous people of the land that they find in Vinland. But other than that, they're not very good sagas. So what I would recommend is reading a saga like Gisli Saga, or Egil Saga, or Hravinkel Saga. And all of these, by the way, if you're reading them in English, I'd really recommend this volume put out by Penguin. It's quite good, and it has a very good smattering of the sagas of the Icelanders. You get kind of all the basic ones in here. But I would actually recommend for you to read Gisli Saga next, and or Hravinkel Saga, before you jump into Njal Saga, because Njal Saga is the longest saga by a lot. It's like over 300 pages. Most sagas are like between like 20 and 50 pages otherwise. So yeah, I hope that made sense. I'd recommend getting this volume and starting with Hravinkel Saga specifically. It's very basic feud that happens, but you'll get a lot of how the law works, how the legal system works, how feuding works in the sagas. And then you can move to Gisli Saga, and then you can move to Njal Saga, or one of the longer ones, either Njal Saga, Egil Saga, or Grettir Saga. Though I'd recommend saving Grettir for later, even though that saga is one of my favorites, because it is so late chronologically. It does some very weird things that I think you would appreciate more if you have read other sagas. Asks a couple of other quick questions. Do you take notes while reading? If yes, then how? I would say, I do take notes while reading. I would say I actually mix it up quite a bit. I don't have like a one strict method because I always am trying new things. I would say what I do the most is, and what I can show here, I often use tabs, but I find that I actually don't ever look back at the tabs. Occasionally if I pull a book off the shelf, then I'll go to a tab. But when I use tabs, I over tab way too much, which doesn't really help me do anything. I occasionally write in books, but again, I often find that I don't actually go back and look at what I wrote in books. So what I actually do the most recently is I get either a big index card, or I often just cut a piece of computer paper in half, and I just jot down the page number and then whatever notes I have right next to it. If it's like a quote, I'll just write that down, or if I have a thought, I'll just write down the page number and then my thoughts. But then that way, almost every book that I've read in the past couple of years has one of these pieces of paper in the book. So I take it down and I look, and I'll often put like stars next to what I actually think is really important. And occasionally I'll have a separate piece of paper where I'll kind of write more elongated notes if I need to. But that's my main way of taking notes. And then if I'm reading something like for school, I'm reading like essays or primary sources, I usually use the Cornell method of note taking, which you can look that up. But this is what I use in my other reading is more of a truncated version of the Cornell system. But the Cornell system is what I've developed through grad school. That's what I use for my day job, essentially. And then he also asks two more very quick questions. Do you have any plans to make a book review series on medieval literature? Since you're an expert, it'd be good guidance for non-academic readers like us. Yes, I really want to do more stuff with medieval literature. I will say, if you are interested in the Icelandic sagas and you want someone who explores them in a very, very approachable, engaging, and fun way, check out the podcast Saga Thing. It's incredible. It's actually, there's two co-hosts. They both have PhDs. They're both professors. And one of them is actually my former professor. He's the guy who taught me, at least initially, the sagas and most medieval literature. But that series, they go through each of the sagas of the Icelanders. They're trying to go through all 40 of them. And they talk about them in ways that are often academic, but more often very casual, very approachable, very funny, very entertaining. Amazing, amazing podcast. And that's actually one of the reasons why I haven't made too many videos on the Icelandic sagas, is because what they do on their podcast is better than anything that I could do on this channel. But I do want to do more medieval literature on this channel. I have plans to do some in the near future. And then he also asks, when are you going to do another bookshelf tour? I'm eager to see your non-academic bookshelves. Maybe soon, but the problem is that I live in an apartment and I just have books everywhere. All my academic books are on these three shelves for the most part, and then piled on my desk. But for contemporary literature, I have 4 bookshelves in that room, books underneath the TV, another shelf here, 2 more shelves upstairs. There's no organization to it. So if I was going to do another bookshelf tour, I'd have to do some serious organizing. So maybe in the future.